March 3rd, 1944, East Anglia, England. The night before, everything changed. Lieutenant William Overstreet's hand trembles as he grips his pencil, not from fear, but from exhaustion that has soaked into his bones after months of missions that never quite reach far enough. He's writing to his sweetheart back in Virginia, trying to find words for what tomorrow means. Tomorrow we're doing something everyone said was impossible, flying all the way to Berlin and back in a single-seat fighter. The brass kept telling us it couldn't be done. Through his quarters window, floodlights carve harsh shadows across the tarmac. Ground crews move like phantoms in the artificial glare, bolting strange cylindrical objects beneath the wings of his P-51 Mustang. They look absurd, wrapped in brown paper like packages from home, like something a child might build from scraps in a workshop. Some of the boys are calling them paper bags. His crew chief laughs when Overstreet questions their reliability, the kind of laugh that comes from a man who stopped worrying about the impossible months ago. Laminated paper and plastic resin, Lieutenant. Same stuff the Brits have been using. He slaps the tank and it echoes hollow. They'll hold fuel long enough to get you there and back. Paper. They're going to Berlin on paper. The mathematics of aerial warfare are about to be rewritten. Not by superior firepower, not by advanced metallurgy or revolutionary design, but by compressed paper soaked in resin, manufactured in a converted newspaper plant by workers who normally produce the London Times. Sometimes the most important weapons don't look like weapons at all. 3 months earlier, the sky over Germany had become a killing field painted in fire and falling metal. October 14th, 1943. They called it Black Thursday. Though for the men who lived through it, no single word could capture what happened that day. Colonel Hubert Zemke stands at the operations board at Halesworth, watching mission reports come in like casualty lists from the Western Front. Each update carves another wound into the day's accounting. 60 B-17s lost, 600 men gone in a single afternoon. The silence in the operations room has weight, the kind that settles over a graveyard. Of the 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses dispatched to Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, that morning, 60 were shot down by German fighters and flak. Another 17 came home, so shredded by cannon fire and shrapnel that they had to be scrapped for parts. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Over 26% of the attacking force destroyed or written off. Without fighter escort, the daylight bombing campaign wasn't just failing. It was bleeding to death over Germany, one formation at a time. Among the survivors limping back to Thorpe Abbotts that evening was Technical Sergeant Robert Morgan, a ball turret gunner on a B-17 of the legendary 100th Bomb Group. His testimony to intelligence officers was delivered in the flat, exhausted monotone of a man who has seen too much in too few hours. The Jerrys waited until our little friends turned back at Aachen. Then they came at us in waves. Head-on attacks, rockets from twin-engine jobs sitting outside our gun range. He pauses, staring at something the intelligence officers can't see. We were sitting ducks for 3 hours. 3 hours. Alone. Deep over Germany with nowhere to hide. The P-47 Thunderbolts were magnificent fighters, brutal and powerful, capable of absorbing punishment that would shred lesser aircraft. But even they couldn't rewrite physics. With standard drop tanks, they could only reach 375 miles from base. The German fighters knew this. They had measured that invisible line in the sky down to the mile. They simply waited beyond it, circling like sharks beyond the reef, then tore into the bomber formations with methodical, practiced precision. The bombers flew on alone, and the losses mounted, but in a modest office at the 8th Air Force Technical Section at Bovingdon, Colonel Cass Howe was examining something that looked more like an arts and crafts project than military hardware. A fuel tank, made of laminated kraft paper impregnated with plastic resin, manufactured by Bowater Lloyd of London, a company that normally produced newsprint for Fleet Street. Howe had spent months developing this unlikely solution, working alongside British engineers who'd been experimenting with non-metallic drop tanks out of pure necessity. The British were driven by shortage, their metal supplies critically short, every pound of aluminum precious as gold. But hosts saw something different in these paper cylinders, something the British might not have fully appreciated. Advantage: these paper tanks weighed approximately 50 pounds empty. Metal versions tipped the scales at 150. That 100-pound difference translated directly into fuel capacity, into range, into the ability to follow the bombers all the way to the target and bring them home. The construction was deceptively sophisticated. Multiple layers of kraft paper, bonded with resorcinol formaldehyde glue, shaped over wooden forms with internal wooden anti-slosh baffles to prevent fuel from surging during combat maneuvers. Coated with fire-resistant lacquer and aluminum paint that gave them a distinctive silver appearance. They looked fragile, temporary, disposable. They were all of those things, and they were about to change the war. The first combat test came in February 1944. P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group flew to Hanover and back with British-made 108-gallon paper tanks slung beneath their wings. Major James Goodson led the mission, his combat report noting with clinical precision that the tanks performed flawlessly with no leaks, no failures, extending their range by 125 miles. But this was just the beginning. The appetizer before the main course, the transformation accelerated with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang at Debden in late February 1944. Colonel Donald Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group received their first Mustangs on February 28th. The pilots had less than 24 hours to transition from their familiar Thunderbolts to this sleek, unfamiliar machine. Captain Don Gentile, who would become one of the war's top aces, had exactly 45 minutes of flight time in the Mustang before his first combat mission. 45 minutes to learn a new aircraft before taking it into combat. There was no time for anything else. The bombers couldn't wait. But it was the marriage of the Mustang and those paper drop tanks that would rewrite the rules entirely. The P-51 could carry two 108-gallon paper tanks, now rolling off production lines in increasing numbers at Bowater Lloyd's plants in Sittingbourne and Kemsley. With those tanks filled, the Mustang's combat radius extended to 850 miles. Berlin sat 580 miles from East Anglia. Suddenly, impossibly, the Nazi capital was within reach. The morning briefing on March 4th, 1944 at Debden crackles with tension you could cut with a knife. Intelligence Officer Major John McCulpin pulls back the curtain covering the mission map with the theatrical flourish of a magician revealing his greatest trick. A red ribbon stretches from their base all the way to Berlin. For the first time in history, single-engine fighters would escort bombers to the enemy capital and back. An 1,000 to 100-mile round trip that would fundamentally alter the strategic bombing campaign. Captain Williams, O'Brien of the 357th Fighter Group, remembered that moment decades later in interviews with Air Force historians, his voice still carrying the electric shock of that revelation. You could hear a pin drop. Then someone whistled low. Berlin. We were going all the way to Berlin. In fighters. The crew chiefs had been filling those paper tanks since 3 in the morning, working under dim lights to meet the dawn launch schedule. They had to be careful, methodical. The tanks would only hold fuel for about 5 hours before the gasoline started breaking down the resin, dissolving the glue that held the layers together. But 5 hours was enough, just barely enough to reach Berlin and make it home. The engineering behind these seemingly simple devices was more sophisticated than appearances suggested. Each tank was constructed in 3 main components: nose cone, tail cone, and body. The center section consisted of multiple layers of impregnated paper wrapped around a cylindrical form, while end caps were hand-laminated with petal-shaped pieces called gores, each one fitted with precision. Every tank could hold 108 US gallons of 100-octane aviation fuel, measured at 100 inches long, and underwent pressure testing to 6 psi to ensure no catastrophic failures at altitude. the tolerances were remarkable. These paper tanks functioned flawlessly from sea level to 40,000 feet in temperatures ranging from 60 below zero to 120 above. Workers at WWII, many of them women who had previously worked in the newspaper industry, their hands accustomed to paper and precision, produced these tanks in increasing numbers as 1944 progressed. Additional production came from distributed manufacturing across Britain, with workers in home workshops contributing to the war effort, each one knowing that every tank they completed meant one more fighter could reach Berlin. But the American aviation establishment remained deeply skeptical, even as combat operations proved the tank's effectiveness beyond any doubt. Right field technical experts declared flatly that paper tanks were absolutely unfeasible and will not do the job for which they are intended. By the time this assessment reached England, the 8th Air Force had already used more than 15,000 paper tanks, without a single failure attributable to tank construction. Colonel Howe's response was characteristically direct. He continued pushing production forward, knowing that combat results spoke louder than laboratory assessments conducted thousands of miles from the shooting war. The skepticism from right field became irrelevant in the face of operational success. The first escort mission to Berlin on March 4th saw P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts accompany over 700 heavy bombers to the Nazi capital. Leading the Mustangs was Colonel Blakesley, whose pre-mission briefing was recorded by intelligence officer Captain John Slater. "These paper tanks will get you there and back. When you hit the initial point, punch them off and engage any enemy fighters you find." He pauses, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Remember, with these tanks, we own the sky all the way to Berlin." The mission was not without cost. Nothing ever was. The 4th Fighter Group lost Lieutenant Alan Bataille, shot down by flak near Brandenburg. But the psychological impact on both sides was profound, seismic, world-altering. Luftwaffe Pilot, Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, recorded in his diary that night his shock at seeing American fighters over Berlin. Their intelligence had insisted this was impossible. Their entire defensive strategy was built on that impossibility. Everything they had been told was wrong, he wrote, and you can feel the foundations shifting beneath those words. For the bomber crews, the sight of Mustangs over Berlin was transformative. Ball Turret Gunner Sergeant Dale Rice of the 100th Bomb Group later testified in official debriefings about approaching the initial point when he saw P-51s at 30,000 feet, contrails streaming behind them like white ribbons written across the sky. One waggled its wings as it passed overhead, a gesture of solidarity, of protection. He could see the drop tanks under the wings, paper bags carrying them to Berlin. The impact was immediate and dramatic. When bombers returned to Berlin 2 days later on March 6th with Mustang escort, Luftwaffe interceptions decreased significantly. The Predators had become prey. Major Walter Nowotny, one of Germany's top aces with 258 victories to his name, reported to Luftwaffe High Command with the flat assessment of a professional who understood exactly what this meant. The Americans had solved the range problem. Their tactical advantage was gone. The production chain for paper drop tanks exemplified Allied industrial cooperation and innovation operating at scale. WWII, which had been producing 60% of British newsprint before the war, converted portions of their facilities at Sittingbourne and Kemsley to tank production. The company's experience with paper lamination and their access to raw materials made them ideal for this work. The kraft paper came from recycled newspapers and packaging materials that would have otherwise been wasted. The resorcinol formaldehyde glue was produced at Imperial Chemical, industry's plants using materials that didn't compete with other war priorities. The entire production process from raw material to finished tank took approximately 72 hours. Additional production came from that distributed manufacturing model spread across Britain, workers in home workshops contributing to the war effort in ways they might never see but whose impact rippled across Europe. The tanks were wrapped in heavy brown paper for shipping, and could be transported with brutal efficiency. Far more paper tanks fitting in transport aircraft than metal tanks, multiplying logistics capacity by factors of 10. Master Sergeant Donald Manor of the 357th Fighter Group, responsible for drop tank logistics at Leiston, kept detailed records that survived the war and now tell the story of those pre-dawn preparations. His team would begin work at 2 in the morning on mission days, unwrapping tanks with cold-numbed fingers, checking seals with flashlights, mounting them on aircraft pylons with practiced efficiency. The mounting system was elegantly simple. Tanks attached to standard bomb shackles with a quick-release mechanism. A pull of a lever in the cockpit would jettison both tanks simultaneously, essential for combat maneuvering when seconds meant the difference between kill and killed. The fuel feed system used the aircraft's existing plumbing, check valves, preventing fuel loss when the tanks were released and fell away toward the German countryside below. The critical limitation was chemistry itself. The resorcinol glue would slowly dissolve from the fuel's solvent effects, causing leaks within hours. These were strictly single-use items that had to be filled immediately before takeoff, disposable by necessity. But that disposability was a feature, not a flaw. By May 1944, the impact of long-range fighter escort was measurable in stark, undeniable numbers written in survival rates and loss statistics. Before the introduction of effective long-range escort, the 8th Air Force experienced catastrophic losses that threatened to make the entire daylight bombing campaign unsustainable. October 1943 had seen monthly loss rates of approximately 7.6%, with individual missions like Black Thursday reaching 20.6%. Once P-51s with drop tanks began regular escort missions, the overall campaign loss rate dropped to between 1.5 and 2.2%. This dramatic reduction saved thousands of aircrew lives and made the strategic bombing campaign not just possible, but inevitable. Technical analysis by Republic Aviation. Engineers revealed unexpected advantages of the paper tanks beyond simple weight savings. They had better aerodynamics than metal tanks, creating less drag and allowing higher speeds. They were also less likely to explode when hit by enemy fire. The paper and resin construction would tear and vent rather than fragment into shrapnel, and the tanks were partially biodegradable, breaking down within months when left in fields or forests, unlike metal tanks that became permanent hazards to farming and livestock. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, who would end the war with 24 aerial victories, flew the March 6th mission to Berlin. His combat report, preserved in the National Archives, provides the detailed pilot perspective on paper tank performance at altitude. He took off at 10:45 hours with 2 108-gallon paper drop tanks. Perfect fuel transfer throughout the flight. Released tanks at 13:47 hours near Wittenberger when bounced by Focke-Wulf. 190s. Engaged immediately after release. The weight difference after dropping the tanks dramatically improved aircraft performance. Suddenly lighter, suddenly faster, the Mustang became a different machine. He shot down one FW-190, damaged another, and returned to base with 45 gallons remaining in his internal tanks. Without those paper tanks, he noted in his after-action report, they would have turned back at Brunswick. The mission would have been impossible. The strategic impact extended far beyond just bomber protection. With extended range, American fighters could conduct fighter sweeps deep into Germany, attacking airfields, strafing rail yards, hunting targets of opportunity. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, conducted a tactical analysis in May 1944 that concluded the extended range provided by British paper tanks had fundamentally altered the air war. The initiative had shifted. They could now carry the fight to the enemy's doorstep every single day. German response to the Allied range advantage was documented in captured records after the war, and reading them now, you can feel the growing desperation. A technical intelligence report from Messerschmitt, AG dated May 15, 1944, acknowledged that the enemy was using disposable fuel tanks of revolutionary construction, laminated paper, and phenolic resin impregnation. They had attempted to duplicate this technology. They failed. Not for lack of technical knowledge. The Germans understood the engineering, but their war economy was already fracturing under pressure. They lacked paper production capacity, with most German paper mills converted to producing military maps and documentation. The resin materials were prioritized for aircraft construction. Most critically, they lacked the distributed manufacturing model that made Allied production so resilient. They couldn't match the scale. The Luftwaffe's senior leadership understood the implications immediately. In post-war interrogations, high-ranking Luftwaffe officers acknowledged the strategic impact of long-range fighters with a frankness that comes from defeated men with nothing left to hide. While the specific quote, often attributed to Hermann Göring about seeing Mustangs over Berlin, cannot be verified in primary sources, documented testimony from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey shows he stated that long-range Allied fighters delivered a major strategic blow to German planning and were one of the most decisive factors in the ultimate outcome. He acknowledged that when fighters appeared over Berlin, the results would be, in his words, tragic for Germany. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland similarly testified that American fighters ranging over all of Germany with impunity had effectively broken the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy. The concentric rings of fighter bases, the carefully calculated interception zones, the entire architecture of German air defense, all of it obsolete overnight. By June 1944, paper drop tanks had become standard equipment for fighter operations across the theater. Sergeant James Patterson, quartermaster at Duxford, maintained logistics records showing that paper tanks required 1/10 the shipping space of metal tanks when transported from factory to airfield. A single C-47 transport could carry hundreds of flattened paper tanks compared to 40 metal tanks. This efficiency meant forward airfields in France after D-Day could be supplied by air, maintaining operational tempo, even when ground supply lines were stretched thin or cut entirely by German counterattacks. The environmental impact. Though not a consideration at the time when survival mattered more than sustainability, was documented by French farmers after the war. Metal tanks that littered their fields killed cattle, damaged plows, required extensive cleanup operations lasting years. Paper tanks dissolved in rain over a single winter, leaving only metal fittings that could be sold for scrap, an unexpected benefit of disposability. Captain Donald Bryan of the 352nd Fighter Group experienced one of the rare tank failures on July 18, 1944, the only documented case in his entire squadron. The port tank developed a leak at 25,000 feet over Hanover, losing about half its fuel before he could isolate it and switch it off. He still made it home with fuel to spare from the starboard tank, demonstrating the redundancy built into the two-tank system. Even failure was survivable. Technical improvements continued throughout 1944 as engineers refined the design. Second-generation paper tanks featured improved resin formulations that extended fuel storage time from 5 hours to 12 hours, allowing pre-mission preparation the night before, and reducing ground crew workload during those critical pre-dawn hours when every minute mattered. The tanks also received better cold weather treatment, preventing fuel line freezing at high altitudes where temperatures could drop to 60 below zero. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, showcased the complete transformation that drop tanks had enabled. Fighter bombers with paper drop tanks ranged far inland, disrupting German reinforcements hundreds of miles from the beaches, cutting supply lines, strafing columns, making movement deadly in daylight. Captain Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group flew 3 missions on D-Day, each time with paper drop tanks, allowing him to loiter over the battlefield for extended periods, providing cover when and where it was needed most. The ability to provide continuous fighter cover over the invasion, beaches and deep into France, proved crucial to the success of Operation Overlord. Production statistics from mid-1944 show the staggering scale of the operation. British factories were producing thousands of paper drop tanks monthly, with Bowater-Lloyd as the primary manufacturer supplemented by other facilities spread across the country. The entire Allied fighter force in Northern Europe could be equipped with fresh tanks for every mission. Metal tank production, by comparison, remained limited by aluminum availability and required critical resources needed for aircraft production. Colonel Francis Gabreski, leading ace of the European theater with 28 victories, flew his most successful mission on July 5, 1944, using paper drop tanks. Leading the 61st Fighter Squadron to Magdeburg, he shot down 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s after dropping his tanks near Brandenburg. His after-action report noted perfect tank performance at 30,000 feet despite -40-degree temperatures, clean release when bounced by enemy fighters, and critical improvement in climb rate after release. Every advantage mattered in combat. By September 1944, the Luftwaffe Day Fighter Force was effectively broken as a cohesive fighting force. General Galland reported to Hitler that American fighters were ranging over all of Germany with impunity, a statement that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. The long-range escort had not only protected bombers, but had engaged in systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe through aggressive fighter sweeps. German pilot training programs, forced to operate from scattered fields to avoid attack, produced pilots with fewer than 50 hours of flight time compared to 400 hours for American pilots. The quality gap was becoming a chasm. First Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group achieved a remarkable feat on October 7, 1944. Flying with 2 108-gallon paper tanks, he escorted bombers to Politz near the Polish border, a round trip of 1,400 miles. After dropping his tanks, he shot down 2 Messerschmitt Me-262 jets, becoming one of the first pilots to down Germany's revolutionary jet fighters. The future met the past, and the past won because it had range. The efficiency of paper tank logistics became crucial during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, with forward airfields hastily constructed and supply, lines strained by German counteroffensive. The lightweight, compact paper tanks could be delivered by light aircraft or even parachute drop. Captain Jack Ilfrey, commanding the 20th Fighter Group, documented surge operations during the Bulge. They flew 3 missions on December 23rd, each time with fresh paper tanks. Ground crews able to rearm and refuel, including mounting new tanks in 20 minutes. Speed, flexibility, the ability to respond immediately to changing circumstances. German technical intelligence officer Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, captured in April 1945, provided post-war testimony about the impact of Allied drop tanks to U.S. interrogators, and his assessment was brutally honest. We tracked every innovation in Allied fighter capability. The appearance of paper drop tanks was more strategically significant than any new aircraft type. It meant nowhere in the Reich was safe from fighter attack. Our entire air defense strategy, based on concentric rings of fighter bases, became obsolete overnight. The numbers from the Strategic Bombing Survey were conclusive, undeniable. In 1943, before widespread use of long-range escort, German fighter production had actually increased despite intensive bombing. By late 1944, with Mustangs ranging over every German factory, fighter production dropped 40%. More critically, fuel production fell 90%, grounding even the fighters that were built. You can't fight without fuel, no matter how many aircraft you have. Lieutenant Colonel John Landers, commanding officer of the 78th Fighter Group, flew 103 combat missions, many with paper drop tanks. His assessment, provided to Air Force historians in 1962, emphasized that the paper drop tank was the unsung hero of the air war. Simple, cheap, and absolutely essential. Without those British paper tanks, escort to Berlin would have been impossible. And without that capability, the Luftwaffe could not have been broken. The production techniques developed for paper drop tanks influenced post-war manufacturing in unexpected ways that rippled through civilian industry for decades. The lamination process was adapted for civilian aircraft components and eventually aerospace applications. The quality control procedures established at Bowater Lloyd became standard across British manufacturing. Workers trained in precision paper construction founded companies producing everything from aircraft interior panels to architectural components. War technology becoming peace industry. Major Richard Turner of the 356th Fighter Group provided a combat pilot's perspective in his 1946 memoir, calling the paper tanks "our passports to Berlin" that looked ridiculous but worked perfectly. He flew 89 missions with paper drop tanks without a single failure. 89 times those paper cylinders held fuel at altitude, transferred it flawlessly, released cleanly when jettisoned. Perfect reliability from disposable technology. Soviet observers attached to 8th Air Force units reported back to Moscow about the paper tank innovation, and their analysis reveals how revolutionary this simple solution appeared to outside observers. Colonel Ivan Kozhedub, the Soviet Union's top ace, tested, captured German drop tanks and compared them to American paper tanks in 1945. His report noted that American tanks were superior in every measure, through brilliant simplicity, not advanced technology. The production surge for the final offensive into Germany demonstrated Allied industrial might operating at peak efficiency. Every fighter mission over Germany employed fresh tanks. Ground crews at forward bases in Belgium and Holland could equip entire fighter groups in hours rather than days. The logistics chain had become a well-oiled machine. Lieutenant Robert Powell of the 55th Fighter Group experienced the ultimate test of paper tank reliability on March 24, 1945 during Operation Varsity, the Rhine crossing. He took off at 0600 hours with two 108-gallon paper tanks, flew to the Rhine, dropped tanks when engaged by Me-262s near Frankfurt, fought for 15 minutes, landed at a forward strip, took on new tanks, and flew another mission the same day. The system's flexibility and reliability had become routine. The last major employment of paper. Drop tanks in the European theater came on April 25, 1945, when Mustangs escorted reconnaissance aircraft to Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, a round trip of 1,400 miles. The mission demonstrated total Allied air dominance, fighters ranging over the furthest corners of the Reich, unopposed. The war was ending, but those paper tanks were there at the finish. Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr., commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, the famous Tuskegee Airmen, employed paper drop tanks on escort missions from Italy into southern Germany. His after-action report from March 31, 1945, stated that the 108-gallon tanks allowed them to escort bombers to Munich and engage enemy fighters throughout the mission with perfect performance at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. These simple paper tanks, he wrote, gave us the range to prove our worth as fighter pilots. The psychological impact on German civilian morale was documented in captured letters and diaries, and reading them now reveals the cumulative weight of seeing those fighters overhead, day after day. German citizens wrote about American fighters constantly overhead, dropping fuel tanks made of paper in parks and streets, demonstrating such wealth and industrial capacity that they could carry fuel in paper containers and simply throw them away after use. The material abundance was as demoralizing as the bombs themselves. Post-war analysis by the Pentagon revealed the strategic importance of the paper drop tank program in cold economic terms. The savings in aluminum alone justified the entire program. The reduced shipping costs, simplified logistics, and decreased ground crew requirements multiplied the benefits exponentially. Most importantly, the extended fighter range saved an estimated 8,000 bomber crew lives by reducing loss rates from the catastrophic levels of late 1943 to sustainable levels by early 1944. 8,000 lives, 8,000 families who got their sons and husbands and fathers back. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command and initially skeptical of American daylight bombing doctrine, acknowledged in his memoirs that the American achievement in extending fighter range through disposable tanks validated their entire strategic concept. It was, in his characteristically blunt assessment, proof that the Americans had been right all along. General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, provided the strategic assessment in his final report with the precision of a man who understood exactly what had been accomplished. The extension of fighter range through auxiliary fuel tanks, particularly the British-manufactured paper tanks, was the single most important tactical development of the air war in Europe. It transformed the P-51 from a good fighter into a war-winning weapon system. The ability to escort bombers to any target in Germany broke the back of the Luftwaffe and established Allied air supremacy. Essential for victory, the human dimension of the paper tank story extended to the thousands of workers who manufactured them, people whose names history doesn't record, but whose contribution was essential. At the Sittingbourne facility, production workers, 70% of them women, operated 3 shifts to meet relentless demand. They knew that every tank they built meant Allied aircrew could fly further and return home safer. That knowledge gave meaning to tedious, repetitive work conducted under time pressure and wartime conditions. The technical specifications achieved were remarkable for such seemingly simple devices. Each 108-gallon tank could withstand 3 Gs of acceleration when full, 9 Gs when empty. They functioned perfectly across extreme temperature ranges and altitudes that would destroy lesser designs. The fuel transfer rate matched internal tank systems perfectly, providing seamless transition during combat with no lag, no hesitation. All this from compressed paper and plastic resin, materials available in any industrialized nation, but combined with uniquely Anglo-American innovation and production capability that turned potential into reality at scale. German aircraft designer Willy Messerschmitt, interrogated after the war, admitted with professional respect that they knew about auxiliary tanks and used them, but never imagined mass production of disposable tanks from non-strategic materials. The Americans and British turned a logistics problem into a production advantage. Coming from a man who designed some of Germany's finest aircraft, this was high praise indeed. The influence on military doctrine was profound and lasting, echoing through decades of subsequent air warfare. The United States Air Force incorporated long-range fighter escort as a fundamental principle, influencing aircraft design through the Cold War and beyond. The concept of disposable components to extend capability became standard, from fuel tanks to sensor pods to weapons pylons. The paper tank proved that innovation didn't require exotic materials or revolutionary technology, just creative application of existing resources at scale. Lieutenant General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command, summarized the impact in testimony to Congress in 1946 with the stark clarity of achieved victory. The paper drop tank gave us the air superiority over Europe. Without it, our bombers would have continued to suffer prohibitive losses. Without it, our fighters couldn't have hunted the Luftwaffe to extinction. Without it, D-Day might have failed. The environmental legacy was significant, though completely unappreciated at the time when survival mattered infinitely more than sustainability. Approximately 15,000 paper tanks were dropped over Europe during the war. They biodegraded within months, unlike metal tanks that became permanent hazards, requiring cleanup operations. Extending into the 1950s, French agricultural reports from 1946 showed no lasting soil contamination from paper tanks, while areas littered with metal tanks required extensive remediation. The quality control innovations developed for paper tank production influenced manufacturing standards worldwide in ways that extended far beyond military applications. The requirement for complete reliability in a disposable product drove development of statistical process control methods adopted across industries. The concept that simple, good enough solutions could outperform over-engineered. Alternatives became a manufacturing philosophy that reduced costs while maintaining reliability. The strategic implications extended well beyond World War II into the Cold War era and beyond. During the Berlin airlift of 1948, Transport aircraft used disposable tanks based on wartime paper tank technology to extend range. The Korean War saw improved versions employed by F-51 Mustangs flying from Japan. The technology evolved into modern composite materials, but the fundamental concept of lightweight disposable range extension remained unchanged. Proof that good ideas don't become obsolete, they just evolve. The last combat use of paper drop tanks in world. War II came on May 7, 1945, one day before V-Day, when Mustangs of the 357th Fighter Group flew a final patrol over Czechoslovakia. Lieutenant Robert Foy, flying his 89th mission, recorded carrying two 108-gallon paper tanks to Prague and back, dropping them over a farmer's field near Pilsen. The war ending as it had been fought, with paper tanks making the impossible routine. Veterans' reunions throughout the decades included crew chiefs and pilots sharing paper tank stories, the technical details blending with human memory and emotion. At the 1995 50th anniversary gathering at Duxford, former Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland met with American fighter pilots in the kind of reconciliation that only time allows. When asked about the turning point of the air war, Galland pointed to a displayed paper tank with wry respect. That simple thing meant we could never be safe, never rest, never rebuild. It brought the air war to our doorsteps every day until we had nothing left to fly. The technological simplicity masked sophisticated understanding of materials science, aerodynamics, and production engineering. Each tank represented thousands of decisions about materials, construction methods, testing protocols, and quality control procedures. The success came from getting all these decisions right, then executing at unprecedented scale with unrelenting consistency. Captain Louis Kurds of the 3rd Air Commando Group, who flew Mustangs in both European and Pacific theaters, compared the impact across different combat zones. The same simple solution worked in Pacific humidity, as well as European cold, demonstrating good engineering that transcended specific theater requirements. Universal applicability from simple design. The legacy lived on in unexpected ways throughout post-war decades. The phenolic resin technology developed for tank construction became the basis for early circuit boards in the electronics revolution that followed. The lamination presses designed for tank production were repurposed for manufacturing television cabinets in the 1950s. Workers trained in precision paper. Construction founded companies, producing everything from aircraft interior panels to architectural components. War skills becoming peace industry. Wing Commander Peter Brothers, RAF fighter leader, who observed American operations with paper drop tanks, reported with bemused respect that the Americans approached war like a business problem, buying range by the gallon in disposable containers. No romance or elegance, just brutal efficiency. The British gave them the technology, the Americans gave it mass production, and together they gave the bombers safe passage to Berlin. The final accounting came in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey's summary report. Cold numbers telling the story of transformation. The development and deployment of auxiliary fuel tanks, particularly the 108-gallon laminated paper tanks, extended fighter escort range from 475 miles to 850 miles, a 79% increase in range that brought every target in Germany within escort capability. The resulting reduction in bomber losses saved approximately 8,000 aircrew lives and enabled the strategic bombing campaign to achieve its objectives. The story of the paper drop tank illuminates a fundamental truth about modern warfare that remains relevant today. Victory often depends not on revolutionary technology, but on innovative application of simple solutions at massive scale. A British paper company, American fighter planes, and compressed paper soaked in plastic resin combined to break the Luftwaffe and secure Allied air supremacy over Europe. The total wartime production of approximately 15,000 paper drop tanks, dismissed as unfeasible by experts who never saw combat, proved decisive in achieving air superiority over Germany. Each tank that functioned perfectly represented a life saved, a mission completed, a step closer to victory. The bombers could finally reach their targets with protection. The fighters could finally fight where the enemy lived, bringing the war to German soil day after day without respite. And the war in the air was won not by superior aircraft alone, but by superior range provided by disposable paper tanks that looked like nothing more than oversized cardboard tubes wrapped in brown paper. But they carried within them the fuel for victory, the means to reach Berlin, the ability to stay with the bombers all the way to the target and bring them home. The innovation arose from necessity in the darkest hours when metal was scarce and bombers were dying in numbers that made the campaign unsustainable. British ingenuity met American industrial capacity, creating a solution so simple it seemed impossible. Paper and resin, newspaper companies and fighter planes. Two nations, two industries, converging to solve one of the war's most critical challenges. Through collaboration that transcended borders and traditions, when Lieutenant William Overstreet flew over Berlin on March 4, 1944, with paper tanks under his wings, he carried with him the culmination of months of development, testing, and production by thousands of workers who would never see combat, never fly a mission, never fire a shot. But their contribution proved as vital as any military victory won in the air. Every layer of paper they laminated, every seal they checked, every tank they wrapped for shipping, all of it mattered. The letter Overstreet had been writing the night before remained unfinished when he took off that morning. Maybe there weren't words for what they were about to do. Maybe some moments are too large for letters home. But when he landed back at base that afternoon, fuel gauge reading nearly empty but still with enough to taxi to his hard stand, he knew they had done something that would echo through history. They had flown to Berlin, and they had come home. The paper drop tank story stands as testament to the power of practical innovation over complex engineering. Proof that sometimes the best solution is not the most advanced, but the most achievable at scale when it matters most. It reminds us that warfare is won not just by those who fight, but by those who build, who manufacture, who solve problems with whatever materials are at hand. A newspaper company in London, workers who had printed the Times, finding themselves laminating paper into fuel tanks. Women who had set type now checking pressure seals. Engineers who had designed printing presses now calculating fuel flow rates and structural tolerances. All of them part of a chain that stretched from factory floor to 30,000 feet over Berlin. The tanks themselves were temporary, disposable by design, biodegrading in the fields where they fell. But their impact was permanent. They changed the war. They changed doctrine. They changed what was considered possible in aerial warfare. They proved that innovation doesn't require exotic materials or revolutionary breakthroughs. Just clear thinking applied to urgent problems with the resources available. In the end, the paper drop tanks were exactly what they needed to be. Light enough to extend range, strong enough to function at altitude, cheap enough to produce by the thousands, simple enough to manufacture in distributed facilities across Britain, reliable enough that pilots trusted their lives to them, mission after mission. Nothing more complicated than compressed paper and plastic resin. Nothing more revolutionary than seeing the problem differently and solving it with what was available rather than what was theoretically optimal. The British couldn't spare aluminum, so they used paper. The Americans needed range, so they accepted disposability. Together they created something that looked like it shouldn't work, but functioned flawlessly when it mattered most. Long after the last mission was flown and the last tank was jettisoned over Europe, the lesson remained. Sometimes the most important innovations don't look impressive. Sometimes they look fragile, temporary, almost absurd. Brown paper wrapped around wooden forms, held together with glue that would dissolve in hours. But those paper tanks carried fighters to Berlin. They protected bombers over Germany. They broke the Luftwaffe's back and secured Allied air supremacy. They saved 8,000 lives and made victory possible. And when the historians write about the air war over Europe, when they catalog the weapons and innovations that turned the tide, those paper tanks deserve their place in the story. Not because they were sophisticated or impressive or technologically advanced, but because they worked. Because they solved an impossible problem with simple materials. Because they proved that sometimes the best weapon is the one you can build right now with what you have on hand. The mathematics of aerial warfare were rewritten not in laboratories or wind tunnels, but in converted newspaper plants in London. The future of air combat was shaped not by exotic alloys or revolutionary designs, but by paper and glue manufactured by workers who normally printed the news. And on March 4th, 1944, when those first Mustangs reached Berlin's with paper tanks under their wings, they weren't just making history. They were proving that the impossible was just another problem waiting for someone to see it differently, to approach it practically, to solve it with whatever worked, rather than whatever was theoretically perfect. The paper drop tanks looked ridiculous. They worked perfectly, and in the end, that was all that mattered.